Good morning everyone, and welcome to this press conference that is being hosted by the Assembly of Caribbean People. So I want to first, of course, thank members of the media who would have joined us, but I also want to thank all of the audience out there because this press conference is also being broadcast live on Facebook. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this press conference. This press conference has to do with the 50th anniversary of the establishment of relations between Cuba and CARICOM, Caribbean Community. Now, at the 7th Commonwealth Caribbean Heads of Government Conference that was held in Chaguaramas in Trinidad in October of 1972, the heads of government of the then 4 independent Commonwealth Caribbean nations, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Barbados, made 2 historic decisions. One, of course, was to convert the then existing Caribbean Free Trade Association, CARIFTA, into what we now know as the Caribbean Community and Common Market, which is CARICOM. The other decision was a very important one, and that was to collectively establish diplomatic and economic relations with the Revolutionary Republic of Cuba. And that is very historic, and we will hear from the 2 speakers that we have here this morning as to why that was important, and they put it in its historical role. But in recognition of the fact that this year, 2022, will be the 50th anniversary of the establishment of that diplomatic relations, it was felt necessary that that be commemorated not just by the heads of government of CARICOM and Cuba, but also by the people of the Caribbean itself. And so we will have this morning speaking with us to give us a little bit more information about another event, another activity or parallel activity that will really focus on the People's Assembly, if you may. With us this morning, we have 2 Davids, and these 2 Davids have really been giants in the Caribbean region, and especially in advancing the idea of regional integration, but also the fundamental transformation of the Caribbean community. And I'm really happy to have them both here with us this morning to talk a little bit more about this upcoming 50th anniversary of the establishment of CARICOM-Cuba diplomatic relations. So I'll first like to start off with the first David Abdulah from Trinidad and Tobago. He is the political leader of the Movement for Social Justice in Trinidad and Tobago, but he's also a founding member of the Assembly of Caribbean People, which was meant to be a forum and a space of Caribbean people and civil society and social movements really coming together to advance the idea and the dream of regional integration. So I would like to invite Brother David Abdulah to speak now.
Thank you very much, Ozzi Warwick, Chief Education and Research Officer of the OWTU Workers Trade Union. A very good morning to my good friend and comrade, Ambassador David Comissiong of Barbados, and of course a very good morning to members of the media who have joined us, as well as those of you who are joining us on our live stream on Facebook. So in Santiago, Cuba, in July of this year, the 8th Assembly of Caribbean People, the 9th Assembly of Caribbean People was held. And at that assembly, because the first assembly was held in Trinidad, at Chaguaramas Convention Center, the very location where, as you mentioned, in 1972, that historic meeting of the heads of 4 independent Caribbean countries, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, met to establish the Treaty of Chaguaramas and to agree to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba. So the first Assembly of Caribbean People was held at that historic location in Chaguaramas in 1994. And subsequent assemblies of Caribbean people have been held in Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Cuba, in Barbados, in Curacao, in Dominican Republic again, in Trinidad and Tobago. And so on the last occasion in Cuba, in July of this year, in Santiago, which is a very historic city in Cuba, That is where Fidel and Raul and Juan Almeida and many others launched the attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953 on July 26, 1953, that started the process of the Cuban Revolution. So in this year, July, the Assembly of Caribbean People met. I myself was not present, but there was another David, a third David was present. That's David Denny of Barbados. And at that assembly, a decision was taken that we should have some activity to commemorate, to mark this very important 50th anniversary of the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between Cuba and CARICOM countries. Now, of course, there were people-to-people relations prior to 1972. So I know, Ozzi, you were at OWTU Workers Trade Union. I was there for many years. And when I started in the union in 1977, the then President General George Weeks, he had been to Cuba in 65 or 66, I think it was, for the first meeting, tricontinental meeting, which was a very important gathering of progressive forces, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist forces that was held in Cuba, that led to the establishment of a Cuban organization known as OSPAL, the Organization of Solidarity of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So the OWTU and Trinidad and Tobago was represented there. And I know Bobby Clark, who passed away sadly a couple of months ago, and was a very close friend and comrade of David Comissiong and myself and so on, and many others in the region. Bobby had been to Cuba in the 60s. And we should say that people like Rafiq Shah and others, although they were in the army in Trinidad, had also been to Cuba before 1970. So there were relations between people of the Caribbean and of Cuba way before the establishment of diplomatic relations. I remember when I was in the Students Guild, we had a sports team coming from Cuba, students, and there was a relationship between our guild and students' bodies in the Caribbean with the Cuban students movement, OCLAI, and so on. So we need to strengthen those relations. And of course, over the years, they have been established in most Caribbean countries, friendship associations. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have the Trinidad and Tobago Friends of Cuba, and so on. So there are those ongoing interactions, but we thought that, and when the Assembly thought that it would be very important to have a major activity to look at the 50 years of formal relations between Cuba and CARICOM. And that, following that, there was a discussion in Barbados when I was there for Bobby's memorial with David Comissiong and David Denny. And David Comissiong and David Denny took the responsibility to action it, and David Comissiong will explain why it is being actioned in Barbados in December. So that's just some bit of background and the details of what is going to happen in Barbados. David Comissiong is best placed to comment.
Okay. All right, good. Yes. Thanks a lot, David, for again reminding us that there have always been relations between people, even before the formal recognition by the governments and the states. I think that is important, as well as the fact that there are many friendship associations with Cuba throughout the Caribbean. And just before I bring on the second David, I just want to remind the public and members of the media that this event is also happening on the backdrop of the fact that the UN overwhelmingly voted against sanctions that have been imposed upon Cuba for many decades. In fact, we have seen the Biden administration seeking to increase the number of sanctions in the face of the fact that the international community have condemned sanctions against Cuba. The votes were 185 countries out of the 193 countries had voted overwhelmingly to end the embargo against Cuba. Only the United States and Israel was traditionally voted against, with abstentions from Ukraine, no surprise, and Brazil, who was under Bolsonaro at the time. So I'm sure that vote will change as the administration has changed, the leadership has changed in Brazil. The next speaker is really another giant in the Caribbean region, not just in Barbados, but throughout the Caribbean, and is also a founding member of the Assembly of Caribbean People. And that is none other than Ambassador David Comissiong. He is the Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM, and he will give us a much better insight as to the activity that will be taking place in Barbados come December 7th. So over to you, Ambassador Comissiong.
Good morning, comrades, and thank you, Ozzi, for those very kind words. Much appreciated. Good morning, David. It's a pleasure to be here to contribute to this press conference. I would like to begin where David left off about the people-to-people contacts between CARICOM countries and Cuba, and to make the point that they go back even further. They go back to the beginning years of the 20th century, particularly the era of the 1920s. Many Caribbean people went to Cuba in those years to work in the sugar industry. In fact, many Caribbean people who had gone to Panama to help build the canal, when the canal was completed, many of them in search of employment opportunities then made their way to Cuba. So there are actually towns in Cuba that virtual replicas of the Caribbean. There's a town called Baragua, for example, that is populated by many people of Barbadian and Jamaican and other Caribbean descent. Guantanamo, the famous Guantanamo, we hear about the Guantanamo base, but Guantanamo, the town of Guantanamo, was also a magnet for Caribbean migrants. So these people-to-people relations are very ancient. But what was very special in 1972 was that our governments were establishing relations with revolutionary Cuba. By 1972, of course, the Cuban Revolution had triumphed in 1959. And soon after the triumph of that revolution, the United States set out to isolate revolutionary Cuba. And so in short order, Cuba was basically expelled from the Organization of American States. And the policy of both the OAS and the American government was to impose a situation of isolation on revolutionary Cuba in this Western Hemisphere. And they were so successful that by 1972, every independent country of this hemisphere had terminated diplomatic relations with Cuba, with the exception of Mexico and Canada. And so when our countries became independent, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Barbados, they were virtually instructed that they were to have nothing to do with revolutionary Cuba. And so in 1972, these four Caribbean countries were then the youngest and smallest independent countries of this Western Hemisphere. And to the credit of the leadership of those countries, they came together at Chaguaramas and decided that the US State Department nor the OAS was going to determine for them what their foreign policy should be. And they made this historic collective decision, established diplomatic and other relations with revolutionary Cuba. And so they did it in defiance of both the US government and the Organization of American States. And it proved to be truly historic because they set an example that was then followed by much bigger countries all across our hemisphere. And so they broke the ice. They broke the ice. And in the years following 1972, countries all across the Western Hemisphere followed suit. and extended diplomatic recognition to Cuba. So it's very historic, and it really started a deep relationship between CARICOM and Cuba, a relationship that has lasted up to today. Now, they made the decision at Chaguaramas in October 1972, but the diplomatic recognition was actually effected on the 8th of December of 1972. So the 8th of December is recognized in CARICOM and in Cuba as CARICOM Cuba Day. And in recent years, CARICOM and Cuba have been holding a triannual CARICOM Cuba Summit, Heads of Government Summit on the 8th of December. The seventh summit, the seventh one, was actually held on the 8th of December 2020. So the next one was actually scheduled for the 8th of December 2023. But in recognition of the fact that this year is the 50th anniversary of the establishment of relations, our heads of government decided to bring forward next year's summit to this year. And initially, that Heads of Government Summit was to be held on the correct day, the anniversary day, the 8th of December. But unfortunately, that coincided with a very important summit of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, which is being held in Angola, and which Cuba and all of the CARICOM countries are expected to attend. So the decision was taken by CARICOM and Cuba to bring forward this 50th anniversary celebration summit to the 6th of December. Tuesday, the 6th of December, it will be held right here in Barbados. And so since you're going to have coming into Barbados for that Heads of Government Summit on the 6th of December, big delegations from Cuba and from all of the CARICOM countries, we thought it made sense to complement that activity with a civil society activity on the following day. And of course, we are inviting members of the governmental delegations that will be in Barbados to attend the one-day colloquium that we will be holding at the University of the West Indies on Wednesday, the 7th of December. And when I say we, I mean the University of the West Indies, the Cuban Embassy in Barbados, the Assembly of Caribbean People, the Caribbean chapter of the International Network in Defense of Humanity, the Barbados-Cuba Friendship Association, many Caribbean civil society organizations that express solidarity with Cuba have come together to stage this one-day colloquium. And so it's a one-day colloquium that is commemorating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of relations between CARICOM and Revolutionary Cuba. And basically, it will consist of 6 panels. And I just list the panels. They will give you a good idea of the ground we'll be covering. So we will begin, the first panel will be titled Half a Century of Fighting the Blockade Against Cuba. There'll be a big focus on the blockade, not just the damage that it has done, but also what more can we do to help bring about the termination of this blockade. The second panel will be reflections on major milestones and turning points in the 50-year CARICOM Cuba journey. So we want to do a review of the history and all of the major developments in that history. The third panel, 50 years of CARICOM Cuba cultural, and artistic interactions, as well as people-to-people relations. And this will be very interesting as we look at all of the ways in which we have collaborated in culture and the arts and people-to-people relations. And we will have eminent panelists like Barbados's cultural ambassador, Dr. Anthony Mighty Gabby Carter. We will have Fernando Gonzalez, one of the Cuban Five and head of Cuba's Institute for Friendship with the Peoples of the World. We also expect to have very, very famous Cuban poet Nancy Morion with us in Barbados to be part of this panel. The panel number 4 will be examining the CARICOM Cuba educational, medical, scientific, and technological collaboration. And as we know, right here in Barbados, right now as we speak, we have a 72-member Cuban Medical Brigade. In fact, the Cuban Medical Brigade has been in Barbados since April of 2020, helping us to deal with the pandemic. So we're going to look at that whole history of scientific and technological. We're going to look at the Cuban scholarship program, for example, the medical brigades. Number 5, Cuba CARICOM People's Conversation. So we're going to have panelists Caribbean people who lived in Cuba, Cuban people who lived in the Caribbean, and we're going to bring them together just to talk for an hour to share perspectives about living in both regions. And then we end with a very important panel titled Current Realities and Prospects for the Next 50 Years of CARICOM Cuba Relations. So we're looking forward. How do we see this relationship developing from here? And we will have some very eminent Caribbean personalities on that panel, led by our brother and comrade, Brother David Abdulah, and also including a very distinguished Cuban scholar who is at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. She'll be making her way to Barbados to participate, Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia. Of course, there are many, many other panelists whose names I haven't mentioned. I've just really focused on giving you an idea of the themes. But this one-day colloquium will be chock-a-block with very outstanding scholars, artists, and activists. It will be a dual program in that it will be both physical and virtual. But we are inviting persons who could make it to Barbados. Come to Barbados, because this is an historic event. Come to Barbados, be there for the Heads of Government Summit on the Tuesday, and also for this one-day colloquium on the Wednesday. But persons who can't make it to Barbados, they will be able to access the colloquium virtually. So that's it from me, Ozzy.
Yes, thanks very much, Ambassador Comissiong. I just want to reiterate something that I think is so important, and what makes this so historic, that we were the youngest and smallest countries, just some islands in the Caribbean Sea. And we were young, we just became independent, but we had the fortitude to exercise our sovereignty, our sovereign right to decide who to establish relations. Because I'm sure, as anyone can imagine, in 1972, in the height of the Cold War, the United States would have been putting pressure on these on our young nation states. But the leadership had the tenacity to exercise their sovereign right to decide who to establish relations. And it showed that small Caribbean countries played a major geopolitical role because, as you said, it would have been us who opened the doorway for other countries, bigger countries, to finally establish relations with Cuba. So it meant that the leadership at that time, Caribbean leadership at that time, really understood their role in world history. Something that one can argue is severely missing now in terms of the current crop of leaders. But maybe with the exception of Mia in Barbados.
Not only Mia, there are others as well.
But I think the topics you have outlined have really made this activity very exciting, Ambassador. I mean, we're talking about ending the blockade, achievements over the last 50 years, culture and arts, people-to-people relations, education, exchange of experiences, and of course, ending it with a look into the future. What will the future look like? So I think you have really created some excitement around this particular historic activity. As you said, it's physical, both physical as well as virtual. I too would like to encourage persons to go to Barbados. I mean, I've been to Barbados several times and the hospitality there is fantastic. So if you really could get that opportunity to be part of that historic moment and you can go, please do so. And I would also like to ask the media to really cover this event, not just the heads of government event, but really pay attention to the people's event. Because as stated by both Davids here this morning, the people-to-people relations was long established before the official recognition in 1972. I'd like to invite any member of the media who may want to ask a question. You just raise your hand. You click on the raise hand icon and I will permit you to speak. If not.
Yeah, while you're waiting on that, I don't know if there are also any comments by people on Facebook. I haven't been able to monitor the Facebook page to see what is happening. But I just wanted to add two, three, anecdotal things. I remember as a boy growing up in Jamaica, in the Gleaner, which was the newspaper at the time, the only newspaper in Jamaica when I was growing up. In the death announcements, you actually had death announcements of people who passed away in Guantanamo in Cuba. That is how close the relationship is. And I recall Lloyd Best also saying that he had gone to Cuba and interacted with people who were still playing cricket, which would have come out of the West Indies because cricket comes out of English.
David is stuck.
David, I think you got stuck. Maybe some internet challenges. All right. Well, I also haven't seen anything other than persons saying good morning. Oh, David, you may have to repeat a little bit because you got stuck for a short moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I'm not sure why. Yeah, I was saying that in Santiago, just outside Santiago, there's actually a steel band. And I visited that steel band in 2019. And, they came out and performed while I was there and so on. So the dynamic at the people-to-people level is very strong. And Fidel, when he was the president of Cuba, and I heard him say this on many occasions, publicly in major events, conferences, that he was deeply appreciative. And he was saying that on behalf of the Cuban people, on behalf of the party and the government and so on.
David is stuck again. But
yes, he seemed to be having some challenges.
You can fill in? I could finish the statement for him because Fidel said that to me. I met Fidel in Havana around about maybe 1990, and he told me that.
Okay.
You were stuck again, David. Yeah, you were stuck again. So I was finishing the thought for you.
Oh, okay.
I was making the point that Fidel actually said that personally to me. In
Okay.
1990, I met Fidel at a trade union conference in Havana. And, you know, one day, Fidel turns up at this conference, and I was the only English-speaking person at the conference, and all the Latinos gathered around Fidel, and I was shunted aside, not being able to speak Spanish. And then one of the interpreters saw me there and held me by the hand and pulled me through the crowd and introduced me to Fidel. And Fidel proceeded to engage me in conversation, must be for close to 20 minutes. And he expressed how appreciative Cuba was of this, of the step that these four courageous Caribbean countries had taken in 1972. And let's mention the leaders. We are talking Dr. Eric Williams, Michael Manley, Forbes Burnham, and Errol Walton Barrow. We give credit to the four of them for having that sense of self-respect and dignity to say to these powerful entities, you cannot determine for us what our foreign policy must be. And we stress again, they did it collectively. And of course, strength came from that unity. If they had each sought to do it individually, it would have been more difficult. So there's a lesson in that, you know, there's strength in acting in unity. But yes, David, Fidel did make that point to me personally.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
all right.
And he initiated these conferences, these CARICOM Cuba summits in recognition of that.
Yeah. Now, okay.
Yes.
Now, before we close off, I want to again use the opportunity to encourage all those who are listening, especially since we are broadcasting live on 2 Facebook pages, that, you know, persons make the effort, of course, to physically be there, but also to join virtually. All our scholars, activists, artists, both in the Caribbean territories, but also in the wider Caribbean diaspora. But how I would like to end, I would like to ask the both Davids to share with the listening audience, why is this important to me as a Caribbean person? May not be a scholar, I may not be an activist, I may not even be an artist. I'm just a Caribbean worker, you know, trying to get by. Why should this matter to me? I know it's a kind of a big question, but I'd like you to speak to the ordinary working Caribbean person. Why is this important? And why should they get excited about it? I don't know which one want to go first.
All right. Well, firstly, Cuba is a Caribbean country, yes, and that is very, very important, and has had, you know, the same experience of colonialism, of the genocide of the indigenous people, of the first peoples, of sugar, of plantation, of slavery, and of resistance to all of that. So that's the first point, that Cuba is that common history and experience. The second point is that Cuba has done so much for us as a people. I mean, we have had in Trinidad and Tobago the Cuban medical brigades for probably, what, 15 to 20 years now. So they've been here for a very long time. Our second Olympic gold medal winner, Keyshawn Walcott, is trained by a Cuban coach. Yes. And so Cubans have contributed to us in many spheres. There are many of our young people who have been able to study medicine, architecture, engineering, sports management and coaching, and other disciplines, economics and so on, in Cuba when they didn't have those opportunities in Trinidad and Tobago. This would have been before GATE and so on. So Cuba has, in spite of all of its difficulties of the blockade, which has choked off the economy and made life very difficult for ordinary Cuban people, they have opened their arms in solidarity and friendship and brought us into their country and assisted us in so many ways. And so we have to reciprocate. Cubans went to Southern Africa And if they didn't go to Southern Africa to fight in Angola and in Namibia and so on, and defeat the South African army in that famous battle of in Angola, then apartheid would not have ended, and Nelson Mandela himself had said as much, would not have ended when it did. It would have been it would have taken much longer. So Cubans went and fought and died in Southern Africa to liberate the African people from racism, apartheid, from colonialism, and so on. So that generosity of spirit of the Cuban people, in spite of all their difficulties, is very Caribbean. And we need to also share our generosity of spirit with them. And this one-day event, I think, is a celebration of that. It is not only analysis and all that. In my view, it is a celebration of our Caribbean unity and identity.
Thank you. Ambassador Comissiong?
Yes, thanks, Ozzy. Of course, David has given all kinds of compelling reasons, but I would put it into an overarching perspective. Our people, Caribbean people, we were brought to this region as enslaved people, as indentured servants. We were brought to a region colonized by European powers, divided, separated, and we have been fighting ever since. We have been fighting for our freedom. We have been fighting for our self-determination. And ultimately, we are fighting to establish our Caribbean civilization. Cuba constitutes 1/3 of the landmass and of the population of the Caribbean. Cuba is integral to the entire process of constructing our Caribbean civilization. There's no Caribbean civilization without a territory that constitutes 1/3 of your population and of your landmass. Our mission as the descendants of formerly enslaved and indentured and oppressed and exploited people, our mission is to totally rid our Caribbean of colonialism, to liberate it, to unify it, and to build it into a self-respecting, self-sustaining Caribbean civilization that can take its rightful place in world affairs, that can hold its head up high and make its own legitimate contributions to the affairs of mankind. And so that's the process that we are on. Whether it is CARICOM, whether it's the OECS, the Association of Caribbean States, it is the CARICOM-Cuba special relationship. It's all about building our Caribbean civilization. And that is the overarching, that's the overarching mission and goal that we must keep in mind. That is why the Assembly of Caribbean People, for example, was formed. We are carrying out a historic mission to build our Caribbean civilization. And Cuba, our brothers and sisters, our Caribbean kith and kin from Cuba are an integral part of that historical and historic process. And so that is why events like this are events that we must embrace. And we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do to remove Cuba from that embargo, because if we can accomplish that, if we can free Cuba from all the restrictions and inhibitions placed upon it by that illegal American embargo, there's so much more that Cuba will be able to offer to the rest of the Caribbean. We will take a giant step forward in the construction of our Caribbean civilization. So one of the very important things we will be focusing on, not only at the Heads of Government Summit, but at this People's Colloquium, is to renew that solidarity and to renew our efforts to help free Cuba from that criminal embargo, so that they can play their right, they can better play an even more powerful role in building our Caribbean civilization.
Well, thank you both, Brother David Abdulah and Ambassador David Comissiong. And so all that is left for me to say to our listening audience is, let us all make all the effort to go to Cave campus of UE in Barbados to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the establishment of CARICOM Cuba diplomatic relations on the 7th of December. Let us all make every effort to join, if not physically, but to join virtually in that one-day People's Colloquium, as we all, as Caribbean people, work together to liberate, unite, and build a Caribbean civilization. Thank you.